When thinking of mental hospitals, some negative images come to mind, like what has been portrayed in pop culture and media. While it is undeniable that some malpractice and mistreatment occurred within much older state hospitals, the movement of deinstitutionalization that swept across America starting in the 1950s had far more unforeseen consequences than initially thought. Deinstitutionalization is the movement of replacing long-stay psychiatric hospitals with small local mental health care options. The patients that were once occupying the hospitals were forced into small communities to return to their homes or even into prisons. From a report by the International Journal of Health Systems, it is estimated that during the period of deinstitutionalization, over 100,000 patients were discharged each year from state hospitals such as the Traverse City State Hospital in Michigan. When taking this information into consideration, I was brought to my essential question: what are the consequences of deinstitutionalization in America? Mental illness can be defined as a wide range of mental health conditions that affect mood and behavior. According to the Mayo Clinic, 1 in 5 American adults suffer from a mental illness. Depression, schizophrenia, and anxiety disorders, such as panic attack disorders, agoraphobia, and social anxiety disorders, are examples of such mental illnesses. With this topic, I went into 3 areas of exploration. First, the amount of people with mental illness in the homeless population. Second, the number of prisoners with mental illness. And third, the lack of treatment in out-of-state hospitals. First, there is an extreme lack of treatment for the homeless. According to the National Coalition for the Homeless, approximately 30 to 40% of the homeless population suffers from some form of mental illness, this being 5 times the rate of the general American population. It was also reported that when a person with a mental illness becomes homeless, they are 3 times as likely to remain homeless than a person without a mental illness. Homeless people with mental illnesses encounter more barriers to employment, tend to be in poorer physical health, and have more contact with the legal system than homeless people who do not suffer from mental illness. All people with mental illnesses, including those who are homeless, require ongoing access to a full range of treatment and rehabilitation services to lessen the impairment and disruption produced by their condition. While deinstitutionalization in the 1950s did not lead to the growth of mental illness in the homeless population that we see today, a new wave of deinstitutionalization and the denial of services or premature and unplanned discharge brought about by managed care arrangements may be contributing to the continued presence of the seriously mentally ill persons within the homeless population. In addition to the homeless population, mental illness is incredibly prevalent in prisons. Dae-Young Kim from the University of New York claimed in the article Psychiatric Deinstitutionalization and Prison Population Growth that, quote, more people with mental illnesses are in jails and prisons than there are in state hospitals, unquote. In a report done by the Prison Policy Initiative, it was discovered that more than 300,000 mentally ill patients are in prisons and jails, with a staggering 16% of the 2.2 million prisoners in the United States suffering from a mental illness. Dae-Young Kim also states that, quote, most prisoners with a mental illness have no ready access to mental health care, and that for the majority of prisoners, they receive no treatment, unquote. Of the 16% of prisoners that suffer from a mental illness, depression was the most common mental illness affecting prisoners. Certain mental illnesses, if left unchecked, can lead to the death of the person, the death of those around them, and that can have a devastating effect on the prisoners, the family of the prisoners, and the reputation of the prison. In the song Blowin' in the Wind by the American singer and songwriter Bob Dylan, one line states, quote, how many ears must one man have before he can hear people cry, unquote. This quote fits well with the fact that many people with mental illnesses have no treatment options readily available, which brings me into my last area of exploration, the lack of treatment for someone suffering from a mental illness. Mental illness has no easy way of being treated. Emily Newhook from the George Washington University wrote in the article, Stigma is Only Part of the Mental Health Care Price Tag, that the cost for meeting with a therapist once a week, every week for 1 year could be up to $10,000 in cost. With such a steep price tag, mental health care seems far from easily accessible. Due to deinstitutionalization, those that once would be occupying state hospitals were moved into smaller community settings. It was reported by Namino Kanato from the King's College of London that in these community settings, patients would only return for therapy sessions 50% of the time, and that less than 40% of patients would show improvement. This goes to show that not only are these treatments ineffective, but they are not being successfully utilized by those with mental illnesses. Emily Newhook also stated that if someone with a mental illness gets diagnosed and then receives a prescription from a psychiatrist, they could be facing anywhere to over $100 per prescription dosage. American poet Richard Blanco wrote the poem Looking for the Gulf Motel, where he states that his family was, quote, too poor to eat out, not even on vacation, unquote. The idea of not being able to afford simple things that could easily be applied to the scenario of someone with mental illness, who would have to shell out so much money on treatment alone they are forced into poverty or even worse, homelessness. One could argue that the cost of refunding state hospitals would cause bankruptcy across the nation. However, if the cost of funding small community settings, paying for therapy sessions, paying for prescriptions and medicine, and funding prisons that house the mentally ill is taken into consideration, there is a significant decrease in cost. Patients would be spending less overall on personal treatment and would have to spend a great deal less on costs of living if they are moved into a state hospital. While it is easy to extrapolate the idea of once more funding state hospitals, several solutions need to be considered. State hospitals would be offering asylum to those with mental illness and would protect them from any harm they could receive. If prisoners incarcerated for minor offenses that suffer from a mental illness were moved into state hospitals, that would reduce the cost of funding prisons and jails. In addition to this, it would take those members of the homeless community that suffer from a mental illness off of the streets and into a state hospital. It is important to consider the amount of those suffering from a mental illness and the ability to help them. If state hospitals get funded again, those suffering from a mental illness will have somewhere to go instead of suffering through things alone. If we have it in our power to help those with a mental illness, why wouldn't we? Thank you.